I'm not as talented as Uncle Ken, I've had to write out my speech, so you'll have to be tolerant.
Can't hear you.
Oh,
It's going to go right up to the...
oh, I see. Okay.
No.
Hello? Yes? Okay, I need to look down here as well. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and also acknowledge the fact that this land was never ceded and that it was stolen from its original owners. And I'm going to read my talk because, as I was saying before, I'm not as talented as Uncle Ken, so I hope you bear with me. But please, we'll have a discussion afterwards. Okay, so yesterday my 8-year-old daughter was getting ready for Harmony Day, and she was laying out her Indian clothes and choosing which bindi would go with them. And she said to me with great earnestness, it was quite funny, she said, white people don't have any culture, they're just Australian. From the mouth of babes. Well, I thought she'd hit a particularly interesting nail on the head, because while once a year, those who Australians euphemistically refer to as diverse are allowed to parade their culture in food and clothing, white Australians just are. John Howard's decision to cement his rejection of the notion that racism exists in Australia by renaming the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Harmony Day has resulted in a day when white people can pat themselves on the back and say, as Malcolm Turnbull repeatedly does, that Australia is a successful multicultural country, and aren't they a tolerant and entirely non-racist bunch while sampling a bit of hummus and samosas? So why then are white people so uncomfortable with being called white? I kind of feel like I'm preaching to the converted here, so forgive me, but anyway. Why are white people in Australia and elsewhere around the global north so at pains to deny their whiteness has any impact on the way they move through the world? And why do they tie themselves up in knots to ensure that we know that it's not all white people? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some ideas that will hopefully help us answer some of those questions. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit, if you forgive me, about my own relationship to whiteness. So obviously, I'm undeniably white. I move through the world with the ease that having white skin and so-called European features permits. So why do I say they when I speak about white people? On the one hand, it would be fair to criticize me and say that this is a sleight of hand. And I have absolutely no problem owning the privilege that comes with whiteness. And I'm also acutely aware that those privileges are not shared by my partner or my daughter, for example. So nobody, just as an example of how that works, nobody ever doubts that my daughter is mine, although she has dark skin, hair, and eyes, although I know for a fact that the same would not be true if she were the blonde one. But the reason I think about white people as them is because I grew up Jewish in Ireland in the 1970s and 80s. There, I knew I wasn't white, although I wouldn't have used that language at the time, because to be white meant to be Irish and Catholic. Here we are in the Irish Club. I did feel really uncomfortable walking. I have to tell you, I had a moment of discomfort before walking in here, but anyway.
So Patrick's proud of you there.
Anyway, the late scholar of race and settler colonialism, Patrick Wolfe, wrote that colonialism is a structure, not an event. And I think we can say a similar thing is true for whiteness. It is more than an identity, it is a structure. Despite the undeniable benefits that proximity to whiteness endows even on light-skinned black people, there are still significant ways in which racialized people can never be white. However, structures obviously exist in contexts. So in Catholic Ireland, I knew I wasn't white, but how did that change when I moved between there and my country of birth, occupied Palestine, aka Israel? Now, Israel, as has already been noted in this context, is a colonial state, running the longest occupation of any people by another in the world. despite the narrative of the need for a homeland for the stateless Jewish people and the undeniable persecution that we faced in Europe, Israel can only be understood as a white supremacist political entity established to extend European rule over the native Palestinians and establish a regime of racial supremacy over black and brown Jews as well. So as a European Jew, Israel was established for me and I was intended to be its beneficiary. Okay, so it's easy, having said all of that, clap myself on the back and proclaim myself a race traitor. But I and other white people need to seriously consider what that could mean in practice. Unangak's indigenous scholar Eve Tuck and her colleague Wayne Yang wrote a paper a few years ago with the title "Decolonization is not a metaphor." So we can decolonize and even de-whiten our minds, but it is an entirely different matter to create ways to achieve this materially, in practice. And so I think we need a conversation about how we can begin to do so. Talking about whiteness means treading a careful path between admitting the personal complicity of all white people in maintaining the global regime of whiteness, and, on the other hand, not reducing every statement about whiteness to individuals. Because although we benefit from being white, we only do so because an arbitrary physical attribute, having white skin, has been made the external symbol of a system of power that still shapes global power and politics. And whiteness, of course, sometimes transcends actual skin color, as George Zimmerman, the half-Peruvian murderer of Trayvon Martin, attests. When whiteness is brought up in political discourse, and we see this very often in social media, the immediate response is, "But not all white people," or "Not me, I'm a good white person." To me, this exemplifies the fact that white people understand the unfairness of the benefits that they accrue through whiteness as a system. However, one way to dismantle that system is to refuse to perpetuate it by attempting to cleanse it from within. You cannot say "not all white people," because to do so is to propose that whiteness is redeemable, but it isn't. And this, I think, should be the first stage towards better understanding. Okay, so once we've understood that whiteness is a system, and like other unjust systems such as racism, colonialism, capitalism, gender, and so on, it needs to be challenged and ultimately dismantled, it is possible to think about the benefits and privileges we get from whiteness in a depersonalized way. So we can say something like, yes, I benefit from being white, but that doesn't mean it is a bad thing that I have white skin. It's the way I was born. So what can I do to make it so that I don't have privilege just because I happen to have white skin? We need to ask ourselves why asking this is so hard for so many people. First, it is important to understand that race is a system that maintains white supremacy on a global scale. That is its primary purpose. And people implicitly understand this, and they don't want to be thought of as racist. The dominant understanding of racism that most people have is a moral one. So, being racist is a bad thing, and we all know this. So people don't want to be thought of as bad, and so they reject the idea that whiteness creates inequality and disadvantage because they feel that they're being accused of racism. Now, it's true that many of these people are actually racist, but knowing this doesn't help us get rid of the problem, really. Race and whiteness are constructs, so they're principles around which societies have been organized. They are powerful because we rarely speak openly about this fact, because officially we are all against racism. The main reason it is hard to have a conversation about whiteness that doesn't descend into petty recrimination is because there is a profound lack of racial literacy in a country like Australia. White supremacy is seen as an exclusively American phenomenon. You mentioned South Africa also, Ken. Perhaps it conjures up images of the KKK and burning crosses, or even today's alt-right, dapper Nazis. But what we are confronting is far more widespread and common than that. Australia, as Uncle Ken has reminded us, was founded as a white supremacist project to create so-called a British outpost in the South Seas. But this doesn't originate with federation, but of course with the original act of colonization, which required the entire dispossession of Aboriginal people and culture for its success. And this is of course the same in other colonial states, the US, Canada, Israel, New Zealand, South Africa, and so on. The US critical legal scholar Cheryl Harris wrote a very influential article in 1993, which she called Whiteness as Property. And she explained there that whiteness in the US, a country founded on the theft of indigenous land and made wealthy through slavery, is not a matter of biology or identity. Rather, whiteness itself is a property that is handed down through the generations. And I have a quick quote from her. She says, "The origins of property rights in the United States are rooted in racial domination. Even in the early years of the country, it was not the concept of race alone that operated to oppress blacks and Indians. Rather, it was the interaction between conceptions of race and property that played a critical role in establishing and maintaining racial and economic subordination." So the very concept of property was coded as something that is only understandable to whites. And we see this, of course, in Australia through the foundational myth of terra nullius. Harris again writes, "The racialization of Native Americans," we could think also of Native Australians, or First Nations people, I should say rather, "embedded the fact of white privilege into the very definition of property. Possession, the act necessary to lay the basis for rights in property, was defined to include only the cultural practices of whites. This definition laid the foundation for the idea that whiteness, which of course whites alone possess, is valuable and is property." So in the US, like in Australia, possession of the land is established as white. In the US, following the end of slavery, despite the promise of 40 acres and a mule, ultimately black people were denied that right because it was realized that it would terminally end exclusive white property ownership. The highly selective and utterly colonialist native title system in Australia has a similar aim of ensuring that possession of land is maintained as a white sphere of influence. And of course, current moral panics about Chinese participation in the property market can be seen as another example of this. Loss of white control over land and property is experienced as a deep crisis. And this is because whiteness is institutionalized in the moment of colonial occupation and possession. It is why there is a whole structure of legitimation around colonialism. Indigenous societies could not have survived, it is said, without the advent of white education, infrastructure, and so on. The myth of progress is necessary for the justification of white possession, as Aileen Morton Robinson calls it. And this is, of course, exactly what we saw on the Sunrise show that's already been mentioned, when an all-white panel advocated for the removal of Aboriginal children from their families for their own good, right? Prue McSween's open support for the policies that led to the stolen generations was spoken without irony, considering that there has never been a time when myths of white benevolence did not supersede the rights of Aboriginal families to care for their own kids. So, look, this is only a very partial account of how white supremacy is institutionalized and maintained. But ask most people what they know about these systems, and this sort of tells what you said about, just not knowing, and you'd be met with silence. Instead, the response is often what Dutch Afro-Surinamese black feminist scholar Gloria Wekker calls white innocence. White innocence is the result of the confected ignorance and denial of knowledge of the impact of colonialism on present-day societies, be it in the Netherlands or Australia. Wekker explains that there is a complete mismatch between how the Dutch see themselves as tolerant, benevolent, and non-racist people, and the facts that Dutch society is founded on hundreds of years of colonial exploitation directly responsible for its current wealth. Transposed into the Australian context, this can be seen every time that the country has a hand-wringing moment and well-meaning liberals ask, is Australia racist? There have been countless articles. Now, I've only lived here for 6 years, but there literally have been countless articles and even a TV show with that title during this time. Every time a new atrocity occurs on Manus Island, Nauru, at Dondale, Kalgoorlie, white liberals say things like, "We're better than this," or "When did Australia become so racist? Remember when we used to be better?" This is part of the fiction which contributes to the maintenance of white supremacy. The idea that white people in institutions are inherently progressive and that any manifestations of racism are the product of extremist behavior that is not representative of the majority. But in fact, nothing could be further from the truth. The facts of the matter are, as Lisa Lowe explained in her brilliant book, The Intimacies of Four Continents, racism spreads across the globe at the same time as liberal systems of government were being expanded. A major tool of race is the underlying assumption that the majority of the world's people do not know how to govern themselves and need white people to show them the way through liberal government. So if white people are so innocent and convinced of their inherent goodness despite everything, why are they so fragile? The American sociologist Robin DiAngelo coined the term white fragility to explain the ways in which white people seem unable to cope with the facts of their own privileges. DiAngelo describes white fragility, and I'm quoting her here, as discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequalities and injustice. White fragility manifests in many ways, and it involves distancing oneself from the consequences of owning up to the systems of inequality that racism has created, systems from which white people benefit. I hear this in some of my students, so this is similar to the story you recounted about going to UTS, who want to know why, although obviously there is no truth to this, that Aboriginal people get special privileges to attend university, or cash, yeah? Because we've been taught that white systems of rule are inherently equal and democratic, many people see it as unfair if any measure is taken to try to level a situation of inequality. The belief is that if something is given to someone who has originally been denied their rights, then somebody else has to suffer. But this is inherently untrue. Affirmative action, where it exists, and let's be clear that it does not exist in Australia, has the aim of extending equal treatment to everyone, not taking rights away from anyone. However, because whiteness is founded on possession and exploitation, and the systems that it founded, principally capitalism, make these into a value, people find it very hard to believe this. So we continue to peddle the myth of meritocracy and the sufficiency of hard work. White fragility belies a deep understanding of the illegitimacy of white rule. The belief that every mention of whiteness, let alone privilege, is an attack on white people means that white people understand that there is something profoundly unjust in the fact that whites continue to dominate politically, financially, in the media, education, in terms of health outcomes, and so on. Today, Sarah Keenan, who's a critical legal scholar from Birkbeck College in London, wrote an article in which she proposed that Peter Dutton's offer of asylum to white South African farmers is an example of white fragility. Despite the fact that only a tiny proportion of asylum seekers ever reach Australia's shores, the system of mandatory detention for asylum seekers both on and offshore is legitimized by the idea that somehow Australia is under attack from people who don't share Australian values and who would usurp their goodwill. As Sarah Keenan explained, Dutton sees Australia as part of a global alliance of white nations and people under attack. So white farmers who will undergo a process of returning land to rectify the highly unequal system in which white people make up 8% of the population, yet control 72% of the South African farmland, are interpreted here as being in need of humanitarian protection. The hypocrisy of this in the face of the plight faced by refugees, as you said, Ken, goes without saying. But over and above this, the signal that Dutton is sending out is that whites in Australia and South Africa are more deserving of protection and that their plight that they face is greater than people facing actual humanitarian crisis, because white life here is seen as more fragile and ultimately, therefore, of higher value. Now, it's easy, especially in this room, I think, to distance ourselves from Peter Dutton and to call him a potato or a Nazi or maybe a Nazi potato. But this is another arm in the arsenal of white supremacy, which I'm going to call here white comfort. And this is my last point, you'll be happy to hear. We like to tell ourselves that Dutton does not speak for us. We comfort ourselves by distancing ourselves from his words, but the very point is that we cannot pick and choose which elements of the whiteness project we can live with and which are beyond the pale. We cannot say things which, let's face it, are everyday things that you will hear in any cafe you go into in Australia, like, you know, things like, wouldn't Aboriginal people be better off without welfare? Or, isn't Islam incompatible with the Australian way of life? And see this as disconnected from other statements, like Dutton's kind of statements, that make us feel uncomfortable, that go a little bit too far, that we can't live with. So to dismantle white supremacism, we should really be unable to live with any of the daily realities that mean that white people don't have to hear their way of life discussed as though it were a mere matter of neutral debate with no effect on people's actual experience. A start to ending white supremacy is to stop and think every time we reach for answers that sound like white innocence, white fragility, or white comfort, and ask, why do they trip off the tongue so easily? And maybe next time say instead, I know I benefit from being white. What can I do in my small way to make this less so? Thank you.